Hi friends, welcome back to another true crime episode. I'm Faiza and every week I talk about a true crime story. So if you're interested in true crime, do like and subscribe and let's get into today's case. So today's case is absolutely horrific. Victoria Climbié. Have you heard of this case? Because if you're from the UK like I am, you probably have heard about this child abuse case and it's absolutely horrific. What happened to Victoria is absolutely monstrous. There's elements of torture, child cruelty. So if this is something that you can't handle, please do click out of today's video. Let's get into today's story. So Victoria Climbié was born on November 2nd, 1991. She was the fifth daughter of 7 siblings. She was a very happy, bright young girl. She was just a ray of sunshine. She always had a smile on her face. She was the sweetest little girl you would ever meet. And she just melted people's hearts, you know? Her family wanted her to have a better life, and this is where this devil comes into play. Mary Therese. She is Victoria's great auntie, and she just showed up in the Ivory Coast one day and decided to go to different families and ask them whether or not she can take a child to the UK, to Paris, in order for them to have a better education, a better future. And back in the 90s, in West Africa, in those kind of cultures, it is not really frowned upon. Even in my culture, we raise other people's children and that was the norm back then. And 9 times out of 10, nothing bad usually happens. However, in this case, it just took a sharp left. So with that said, the family accepted and Victoria was in the hands of this depraved monster. In 1998, little before Victoria and Mary Therese arrived in London, they were situated in Paris for a short time. This is where Mary Therese decided to apply for benefits and she got herself an apartment paid by the taxpayers, and she just left Victoria in the house whilst she was just running errands, and she was slowly neglecting Victoria. Victoria then was enrolled in a school nearby, and then the teachers noticed that Victoria's scalp was completely scalded and she had burn marks and her head's been shaved off. She was just completely disheveled, quiet, very, very withdrawn. She didn't say a word and she was severely malnourished. Mary Therese then was showing very controlling behavior. She was screaming in Victoria in French and she was just yelling at her, shoving her, kicking her, and it was just horrific. So Mary Therese wasn't paying her rent in the Paris apartment and she was accumulating a lot of debt, a lot of bills, and she knew shortly the landlord will come and obviously demand payments. So she decided to grab Victoria and flee to London. And this happened in 1999. Victoria was only 7 years old at the time and she didn't know what was happening, but the poor girl was exhausted. She was missing a lot of school as well, and she was just treated really badly. It was horrific. So now Mary Therese and Victoria are in London, North London to be specific, and they were settling in the borough of Haringey. And they decided to, go to the local authority and ask for housing and financial aid and all of that good stuff. And, once she went to those meetings, she did bring Victoria, and Victoria was completely dirty, underweight, disheveled. Her hair was matted, everything was a mess. She was wearing too many layers of clothing and they could see scars and marks on her face and hands. It was clear indication that she was getting abused horrifically by the hands of her great auntie. Things get even worse when Mary Therese gets a boyfriend, a man called Carl Manning. He was a bus driver. He was about a decade younger than her. There's not much information about him, but he's yet another terrible human being. And when Victoria was living with Mary Therese in their little flat, Mary Therese decided to move in with her boyfriend in a one-bedroom flat in North London. And this is where the abuse went worse and worse. And many people, especially her teachers, Victoria's teachers, noticed that she's being abused, and they did flag this up to social services. But when social services went to visit the property, they noticed that they were gone. So they just dropped the case altogether. And Mary Therese gets away with it yet again. The only reason why Mary Therese and Carl Manning were abusing Victoria was because they believed that Victoria was possessed by evil spirits, and they needed to beat it out of her by scalding her with hot water, by shoving cigarette butts into her thighs, by wrapping her up in a bin liner and making her sleep in the bathtub with her own excrements. They were beating her with bike chains. They were beating her up with a wooden spoon. Anything of a hard service. They would attack Victoria, yell at her, starve her, leave her unattended for days at a time. The poor girl couldn't handle the abuse, the stress, the starvation. And what has happened to her, it's beyond comprehension. I can't believe this is a real story. And everybody, including the National Health Service, the police, the Haringey Social Services, the primary school teachers, everybody that's supposed to care for her has failed her miserably. And her death could have been prevented. And this case really gets under my skin because Victoria should be with us right now. She would have turned 34 years old this November. She could have been somebody. She could have lived a full life. And everybody turned a blind eye. The quality of care was completely out of the window. And I could go on, but I think I've made my point clear. Even the hospital staff were treating her injuries and then didn't even flag up the abuse. So they just treated her injuries, all of the burn marks, all of the cigarette butts that were shoved in her thighs, and they sent her right back to the abusive environment, right back to her great aunt. Mary O'Brien was one of the social workers assigned to Victoria's case, and she did nothing. She showed up to the house and marked her off as if nothing was going on. She just wrote down a report, completely tokenistic, and pretended that everything was fine. She didn't even see the signs of abuse. Another social worker called Lisa Arthurworry was another social worker that interacted with Victoria. She met Victoria and she failed to write a detailed report on what she has seen, the condition of the home, the condition of Victoria, her injuries, everything. She failed to do that. She just wrote what everybody wanted to hear. Her assessment lacked the details to act quickly. She didn't report the abuse. So when this became a public outcry, she completely chickens out and removes herself from the social work register. So instead of getting fired, she just pulls the plug on everything. She resigned her duties. How could you live with yourself? How could you turn a blind eye? It seemed like everybody was rushing to get home at 5 o'clock. All of these social workers did not communicate with one another collectively. They didn't put their notes together. Nobody called anyone. And there wasn't even a concern for Victoria. There wasn't even a follow-up based on her health and well-being. And she was getting abused, not by one adult, but two. She was completely dragged out from one home to another. And all of these time gaps, it's what killed her. Nobody acted fast enough. So many missed opportunities to protect Victoria. So throughout the early 2000s, Victoria currently is 80 years old. She was going to hospitals, especially North Middlesex in North London. She went to that hospital and was treated for her wounds. She kept getting fresh cuts, fresh scalding, and she was covered in cuts and blisters. She was bleeding from the mouth. She had a gash on her left eyelid and a piece of flesh was just hanging. It was clear that she was getting beaten black and blue, and she couldn't even speak anymore. She couldn't even lift her head up at this point. So the hospital just treated her wounds, didn't follow proper protocols to report the abuse. Nobody called the police, and then she was sent back yet again. And this cycle continued until Victoria died. Neighbors have caught Victoria being in distress. They could see that she isn't doing well, that she is frail, she's been starved, she's covered in cuts and bruises, she has marks on her hands and face, all over her body actually. They did alert the authorities anonymously, but nobody listened. Nobody took this seriously. Victoria continued to live in fear and pain, and nobody came to save her. Not a soul. She was trapped in a home where she wasn't safe. So Carl Manning, Mary Teresa's boyfriend, he was just partaking into the abuse. He made it clear to Teresa that he did not like Victoria and he didn't want her under his roof. But Mary Teresa didn't listen and she just didn't care. So he decided to abuse her as well. They both treated her with cruelty and neglect. Every time they would feed Victoria, they would just throw food in her face. So in February 2000, Victoria has succumbed to her injuries. She couldn't handle the abuse anymore, the torture, the horrors that she faced. She's being abused for over 2 years and her little body gave out and she has passed away. So on February 25th, she was found unresponsive in Mary Teresa's home. Mary Teresa called 999 and medical staff came and picked up Victoria, and the police was quickly notified. They discovered that Victoria had over 128 severe injuries all over her body, including burns, bruises, and scars. The autopsy confirmed that Victoria died from the horrific abuse that she has endured. So after Victoria's death, Mary Teresa and Carl Manning were arrested. This case blew up. It gained significant media attention. There was a huge public outcry. They were like, how could a 8-year-old innocent, beautiful young girl be treated this way? Why didn't anybody save Victoria? How could all of this happen? Victoria even traveled from the Ivory Coast to Paris under a fake, false passport. The investigations have revealed every horrific thing Victoria has experienced days before she passed. In December 2000, the trial begins, and all of the horrific details on what has happened to Victoria was set alight. Literally everybody found out, the medical staff, the school that Victoria went to, they all testified in response to what they have seen and all of the abuse that she went through. They testified the concerns and signs of abuse that they have suspected. All medical staff were there as witnesses to testify against Mary Teresa and Carl Manning. In December 2000, Mary Teresa and Carl Manning were guilty and they will serve a life sentence for what they have done to Victoria. Carl Manning was sentenced to 15 years to life and he's currently serving time at Wakefield Prison. And Mary Teresa is going to be serving at least 20 years to life and she is currently held at Durham Prison. I read an article that people found out what she has done to Victoria, other inmates and she was scalded with hot water and sugar. That is practically liquid wax and she has significant scars on her face right now. So while Carl and Mary Therese are rotting away in prison, a public inquiry by Lord Laming was released. Lord Laming is a social worker based in the House of Commons, and he made a new policy on better protecting children. So the Children's Act of 2004 was inspired by the horrific case of Victoria Climbié on how to better protect children. And obviously Victoria's case was preventable. I can't make that any more clear. And what failed Victoria was the incompetence of other service workers, the social workers, the NHS workers, the doctors, the police, school teachers, everybody that have noticed that this little girl was suffering to the definition. They didn't communicate to one another. Nobody really went back to see if she was doing okay. So there was a huge breakdown in communication. And now in the UK, it is important, it is by law to communicate with everyone. If a child is suspected of abuse that is obviously not safe, a child protection plan needs to be taken place, and by law, you need to be speaking to one another if you're working under that field. So if you're a police officer, a social worker, a school teacher, there has to be referrals set in place, and it has to be passed on from one person to another. And there should be a multi-agency meeting on how to protect them, what we should do, what strategies that should be taken place, and so on. This inquiry also highlighted many systematic failures that Victoria had suffered from. There was no protection for vulnerable children back in the early 90s and maybe way before that. However, with this change, crime still continues, and 8 years later, another public outcry began. Lord Laming wrote a second report, and this is not about Victoria Climbié. This is regarding baby P. Yet another child murdered behind closed doors. Social services went under a lot of scrutiny yet again. And the head of child protection, Sharon Shoesmith, she was sacked based on the murder of baby P. So I'll be covering that case next week. If you've reached this far, I appreciate you guys being here. I honestly don't know how to end today's video. Victoria Climbié's case really held a special place in my heart because we're around the same age, and I've heard about this case over 20 years ago now. I also studied a little bit about it in uni. So I have read the Laming report. It's quite extensive, but they exposed everything that has happened to Victoria. So may she rest in peace. Her remains, her body was flown back to the Ivory Coast. She has reunited with her family where she belongs, and I hope her family finds peace and they're able to move on. I don't know what to say. Please do stay safe and hydrated, and I will see you guys in my next one. Thanks for watching. Bye.